we're ready to start. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. A little flutter of snowflakes. Thank you for those joining on Facebook. And we are so excited today to hear from two seminal artists and enjoy some phenomenal art in our gallery. As many of you know, my name is Megan McAdow. I'm the director here at the Marshall and Frederick Sculpture Museum. Okay. I'll try to keep my remarks brief, but I do want to take a few moments to acknowledge some special partners, supporters that made this exhibition and this panel possible. So bear with me because it takes a lot of people to pull these things together. First, I would like to extend deep gratitude to Julia Myers, who was the curator of the Harold Neal and Detroit African American Artists 1945 through the Black Arts Movement, both exhibition and also the author of the companion catalog, which is available through Wayne State University Press. Dr. Myers worked tirelessly over years to identify and locate these important works in the exhibition by Harold Neal and his contemporaries, and really document this important time and movement in art history. The catalog is, of course, actually very limited numbers of the catalog are still available today for purchase, and we also have free copies of the wonderful monograph of Shirley Woodson's book, specially available. We've been hiding them in the back for you all attending today. So those will be available for free on a first-come, first-served basis. And I'm pleased to add that our two artists have graciously agreed to do book signing after the talk today, and that'll be over there. But we'll kind of hold off on all things book and getting your copies and things like that after the panel today. Of course, we have to thank the artists that made this exhibition possible, those that are still with us, those who have moved on. If you haven't yet viewed the exhibition, please do so after the talk today. Come back. It's beautiful, it's powerful, it's important, so please check that out. And also, I wanted to remind people that a new practice here at the museum is to put all of our temporary exhibitions online, both the individual works as well as you can take a virtual tour through the gallery, and we put extra content on there. I believe if you don't get a copy of Shirley's book, there we have a downloadable free PDF of that book as well. So just go to our website, marshallfredericks.org, for all that great stuff. Of course, we need to thank our main exhibition sponsor, the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs, and our museum's Board of Advisors, and our museum staff who do all this work to coordinate, plan, install, promote this exhibition and talk. And let's see, last but not least, we want to thank our speakers today, the two of the exhibitioning artists, Ms. Shirley Woodson and Mr. Alli Mcgee, and our distinguished facilitator, Stephanie James. And it is my pleasure and honor to briefly introduce you to each of them before I hand it over to Stephanie to begin today's discussion. So starting with Mr. Alli Mcgee. He was born in Charleston, West Virginia, and his family moved to Detroit when he attended Cass Technical High School for commercial art. Then after that was in 1959 that he graduated. He also attended Ferris State University, receiving an associate degree in commercial art. And in 1961, he attended Eastern Michigan University for fine arts. Then, after much encouragement, In 1965, he set up a studio in Detroit. McGhee was influenced by urban violence and the Black Power movement in the late 1960s. At that time, his work addressed contemporary violence, referring to the Vietnam War and African-American uprising of the time. But in the 1970s, however, he kind of shifted focus and began away from producing more political art, and because he said it was painful and taxing to be involved in that social rage. He wanted to find something more eternal and emphasize how many things humans have in common versus their differences and conflict. His work became inspired by Egyptian and sub-Saharan African art. He used symbols in non-Western art, but also his own personal symbols and abstraction in his style. Of course, we'll hear much more from him. He has produced public commissions such as murals, mosaics, and has had one-person exhibitions, including one that just closed at Cranbrook Art Museum. So it sounds like you've been pretty busy lately. Also busy lately is Ms. Shirley Woodson, who was born in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1936. After her family moved to Detroit, she studied art in elementary and high school. She received a BFA in 1958 and teaching certificate in 1960 from Wayne State University. She did graduate work at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and met artist Richard Hunt there, a Chicago-based artist. She also taught for Detroit Public Schools from 1958 to 1965. She completed a residency at McDowell Art Colony in 1966 and then joined the faculty at Highland Park Community College. In the late 1950s or early 1960s, she joined the Arts Extended Group, which was an organization of artists and educators that opened their own gallery, which later became the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, located in Detroit. Woodson was gallery curator from 1965 to 72 and regularly exhibited there. She was very active in producing and showing her art, and still is, and represented in numerous museum collections. She currently has a solo exhibition that's still on view at the Detroit Institute of Arts through June 12th of this year. So you have an opportunity to see her work here. You have an opportunity to see her works on view right now. Again, two very busy artists. Last but not least, our facilitator today, Stephanie James, is a curator of modern and contemporary art with a focus on art of the African diaspora. She is the Curator and Collections Educator at the Mott-Warsh Collection, one of the largest private collections of art by artists of the African diaspora in the country. It's a fabulous collection. She is director of their gallery, which is the Mott-Warsh Gallery, located in downtown Flint, Michigan. And prior to her work with that collection, she worked on numerous projects with the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. She served as assistant curator of the General Motors Center for African American Art at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And that was from 2002 to 2011. And prior to that, she also worked at the DIA's Education Department from 1995 to 2002. Ms. James earned a master's degree in art history from Wayne State University, a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree with teaching certification from Eastern Michigan University. Stephanie James has organized numerous exhibitions, most recently, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which is currently on view at the Mott-Warsh Gallery, or MW Gallery, through August 20th of this year. She is a frequent participant in the arts programming in the Midwest region and has authored essays on American artists. Stephanie is a native of Detroit, where she currently resides. So I'm going to get out of your way, and we're going to start this discussion. Thank you so much. I'll hand this off. I'll scoot. Stephanie, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Thank you for that warm welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. I really want to first start by just applauding the Marshall Fredericks Sculpture Museum for bringing the exhibition here to this region of the state, for folks to have the opportunity to see this really dynamic work by artists who are long overdue for this kind of attention and exposure. So if you haven't already seen the exhibition, you're in for a treat. I'm likewise thrilled to be asked to conduct this or moderate this conversation between Alli Mcgee and Shirley Woodson. They are two extraordinary artists that I've had the opportunity to know for over 30 years, I think. Shirley, I think you and I met in the early 80s, first met in the early 80s. I was fresh out of undergrad, and like most new art graduates, feeling a little lost, looking for a little direction, once the structure of your school is not guiding you through. And I found that as I came to know the National Conference of Artists through its Michigan chapter, co-founded by Shirley Woodson and led by Shirley. And so through that organization and my encounters with Shirley, I got my additional schooling, particularly in the history and significance of so many African American artists, but just about the art world in general. And I like to think Shirley was like like that really cool aunt, young aunt that hipped you, that filled you in on what you needed to know, what you needed to do. And when I decided to make a journey to New York and live there for a few years, she stuck several phone numbers in my pocket, to folks that I should call on to look out for me, and just folks that I could benefit from talking to. Not just your everyday folks, but folks like Al Loving, Michael Kelly Williams, Robert Blackburn. But that's what kind of connections this lady has always had. And then after that exploration, I returned to the Detroit area and started working at the G.R. Namdi Gallery in Birmingham, Michigan. And I came to know the work of Alli Mcgee and got to know Allie. Allie also doesn't know it, but he also contributed to my education just by inviting me to his art studio. I don't think I had really spent time in an artist studio before, and didn't even know what questions to ask, but Allie allowed me to just be there and observe, and I soaked in what I was seeing, saw his incredible commitment to making art, taking part in that every single day, and his self-motivation, but also his pushing of the boundaries, exploring different media. So I'm really grateful to have had both of them in my life and to influence the path that I chose to take. So for the benefit of Allie and Shirley, and for our viewing, for our audience here, I'll say that the focus of our conversation today will be on Detroit's engagement in the Black Arts Movement, as observed by Shirley and Allie, who have been significant part of, played a significant role in Detroit's art scene for over 50 or 60 years now. On the opening and closing sides of our conversation, I'm going to ask you guys also to talk about how some of the experiences and impressions that you've had that have shaped your art, shaped you as individuals, going into the Black Arts Movement, but also coming out of the movement, how your art has evolved. And I guess for the benefit of our audience too, I should just give a little groundwork or definition of the Black Arts Movement, basically being a Black nationalist movement led by African American artists with a focus on literary arts, drama, theater, and the visual arts, of course, and music. And yeah, its formal period has been listed as 1965 to 1975. So let's start, though. I want to start by asking each of you to share a little bit about your early impressions of Detroit. I'll just bring this image up. As Megan shared in your bios, each of you, both your families, migrated here from the South, as was the case with so many Detroit African Americans, my family included. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about those early impressions before your engagement with the art scene, but you're growing up in Detroit, in the neighborhoods. What did that feel like, and what did it sound like?
Not that quiet.
Yeah, either of you.
She gave the mic.
Okay.
I'll start. Well, every time I begin a conversation or am invited into a conversation, of course my mind goes back, and I remember many, 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 many other things that I find that were things that contributed to, and for, everyone says journey now, so I'll do journey. With the journey, because when she mentioned, when I came, I was an infant, I was 3 months old. And so there was nothing that any remembrance that I had of it being south, north, east, west. I mean, it just, I was little, okay. So, but as I'm thinking, my parents were from a small town. My dad was, my mother was from the farm, outside of the small farm, and all that came with us. So as she was speaking, as Megan was speaking, I said, well, no, it wasn't quite like that, because all of the, I mean, it was more than that, I should say. Our whole discussion early on, for example, with my parents, was them telling me all about their experiences when they were growing up. And my mother was the youngest of 10, and so she always noted that she was not a good cook because she never had to cook, because all the cooks were older than her, but of course she was a remarkable cook. But that she would have to lead the cows to pasture on the way to school, make sure the gate was closed. So in my mind, I'm imagining all of these things. And of course, she told me about the school that she went to, a one-room schoolhouse, the teacher, and sort of the whole experience and all of those feelings, which I continue to ask her, really forever I ask her. I was always asking her questions. Same thing with my dad. So I had that as a very rich source of, along with, what I was experiencing, in my wonderful neighborhood that was filled with, 2 doors down was a young gentleman, and his name was John Remsen. And we were in a small West Side area. And as I was growing up, all the young men would take their long-playing records over to his house and listen to Coltrane and all of these other, well, actually before Coltrane, Miles Davis and all of the called them early revolutionary artists, musicians. And so there was always music. The younger, the ones that did not have the big records, because you'd see, kids, guys, walking down the street with just, a load of albums and going to listen to music. So that was 2 doors from me. I never went, of course. But I mean, I knew it was there, and I knew it was an important part of the neighborhood. So when you mentioned neighborhoods, that was sort of that one. And then there were the people who, the younger boys who were on the street corners doing their harmonies, doing the doo-wop group, and so that was there. So there was, there was just, all of this was right there. I mean, just walk out and know that this person was doing this and all that. So it was very rich.
Yeah.
It was very rich for me. And art very soon became a focus for me. And in my own home, I had a cousin who came to live with us, and she was an artist. She was like a designer. She was, when we get Christmas cards, she would write, we'd have a large card, and she'd have Santa Claus, and her drawings would be all over the envelope, wreaths and all of that. And so, I mean, I had somebody that drew that I was living with in my house, and she was a cousin. And so every time she sat down, I sat down with my pencil and paper and would say, draw me a so-and-so, or let's draw, or let's do this kind of thing. So I'm just saying, so that was all free, everything. And so that was sort of what that was about.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I was born an only child, and we were living in Charleston, West Virginia, and as long as I can remember, I was always drawing on everything. In fact, I was maybe 5 or 6 and would scrawl all over my mother's kitchen cabinets, continue on down the hall. And there were several people in my family didn't appreciate my artwork. In fact, there are still some exist today. But my mom, who was quite talented herself, and she drew and painted, and I used to sit and watch and sometimes participate. In fact, like Shirley had mentioned, going back, fond memories about sitting down to draw with your family. And I would tell my mom, draw me a this, draw me a that. And we would get to the edge of the paper, and she said, no more paper, we can't draw anything else. So back then, before plastic got so popular, you would get your clothes from the cleaners and have a big brown bag to carry them in. So my mom said, okay, I got something for you, Junior. She opened up one of these long brown bags, which ended up being about 7 to 8 feet long.
Wow.
And so we got down on the floor and we drew till we got to the end. And then when we got to the end, I would say, hey, draw. I said, son, you're out of paper. You know, you can't draw anymore, get another. But that was the kind of enthusiasm that I had for drawing and continued my whole life. And my mother was the encouragement that you needed at that time to believe that what you were doing was important in your life. Because in most families, that was not an important thing in your life. More important was becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or an Indian chief. Certainly not an artist. But persevered because of the encouragement. And I had that encouragement all while my mom was alive. And she is probably one of the main reasons I'm sitting here today, because the path in art is not an easy one. And most people that you meet in your life discourage you from pursuing it. And even they think they're being helpful because they don't want to see you waste your time and energy and your parents' money on going to college to become an artist. But just like Shirley, I think we have been at it for a little while. And people would agree that we are serious, and then we'll keep on making art as long as we can.
Hey, end that with a big exclamation point.
Let you know we're not kidding.
That's right, that's right. No, I'm glad you touched on that, because that was, one of my questions was going to be, you know, was your family encouraging you? It sounds like they definitely encourage your creative instincts and all. When did it crystallize for you that you would become artists?
Well, for me, like I said, I used to spend all my time in the evening because I was only child and drawing. And I think the point where I made that decision was after junior high school. It was time to go to high school. There are only two things, like you mentioned, Shirley, about jazz, which I am fanatical about, and I played the saxophone, and I drew. That was it. I either was going to be one or the other. And it was time to choose a high school, and I chose Cass. And the saxophone was not well received at Cass. You could be in the orchestra or band, and band was not exciting to me, you know, marching around in a dusty football field all day. So I decided that, well, okay, art it will be. And so I think at that point is when I kind of agreed between myself, my mom, and God, and everyone else, that art would be what I pursue. And so, you know, here we are.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, Shirley.
Yes, Allie, I was sort of doing the same thing. Mine wasn't saxophone, mine was piano. And everyone, all of the girls and the boys took piano. The piano teacher was in the third block, and you know how you're going, where do you live, first block, second block, or third block, between two major streets, so that's how you were, you know, noted. That was sort of the layout, the way you described your place. And, but anyway, all my little friends, they all took piano, they had piano, they had pianos. I had a piano that I inherited from a family member within our family, an upright player piano. But I was not, you know, a real dedicated student. I finally got a real good teacher who played with the early bands from the 20s, so she was really very, you know, had the ruler and crack your knuckles if you missed doing your scales, knowing, he said, did you practice? Yes, I practiced. And I hit those notes. She said, you haven't practiced anything. But I did improve. But then she told me, oh, this is good. You can now move from this book to this book. And I said, and I did okay on whatever it was. But I didn't want that book. I wanted to do art. So instead of becoming a concert pianist, right, I said, you know, I'm going to do art, because I had just gotten into this gifted and talented program for after-school art, and then I was going to the BIA on Saturdays. So, I mean, that wasn't much of a choice for me. I wanted to be in the, where there's lots of art and lots of people doing it, and seeing all these wonderful things that were out there in the world. And so I was 14, and I declared, that was my own declaration. I said, I am going to be an artist. This is what I'm going to do. And so that was that. It was interesting, we both began with music, I mean, as an option. One other thing, I did not go to Cass.
I know, and we forgive you for that.
Well, I want to tell you why. I want to tell you why. My parents wanted me to go to Cass.
Oh, okay.
But my friends, I said, if I go to Cass, they won't want me as their friends anymore. You know, I mean, that was really important. I said, well, that's all right, I don't have to go to Cass. And then I met all my friends are from Cass. But anyway, no, I did not go. I went to Chadsey.
That's funny, you said that because some of the same things were
Share the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Some of the same things are spoken in our house. You know, the parallels are incredible. But I said the same thing you said, Shirley. You know, the Eastern was the high school in my district. And I said, Mom, I don't want to go to Cass. I want to go to Eastern where all my friends are going to be. She said, son, when you graduate or something, you probably won't even know these people anymore. Go someplace that's going to benefit you and forget about your friends. This is, you know, yeah, it's incredible. But like, hey, you won't even know these people. And she was right, you know. When you graduate from high school, everybody shoots off in, you know, varied directions, all over America and all over the world.
Right.
So you don't even see those people anymore. So Mom was right as usual, but you don't always take their advice, you know.
Yeah. No, those are lovely stories, and that's the kind of picture that I have in my head of, and echoes some of my experiences as well in growing up in Detroit. So let's jump into the decade of the 60s. As we know, the 60s is always characterized as the decade of change. We know it for so much of the turbulence that took place during the 1960s. But there was also a lot of unification that is taking place during those years. But I'm just gonna, we can't hit on everything, of course, but I'm gonna just run down a little list of some happenings, some historical, give you a historical snapshot of some of the things that were happening in Detroit during the decade of the 60s. In 1960, Berry Gordy's Motown Record Corporation is incorporated. During the 1960s, Detroiters were major subsidizers of the national civil rights movement. Kind of make sure where I am with my, feel like I've lost the mic, sorry. Let's see, African-American Detroiters, like blacks around the country, were experiencing inequality in most every sector of life, in hiring practices, wages, education, and in housing. In the early 1960s, the predominantly black neighborhoods of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley were demolished to make way for the I-375 freeway. In 1963, the Walk to Freedom takes place. That was a march down Woodward Avenue led by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It was really organized somewhat as a precursor to the March on Washington that would take place a few months later. And it's also where Dr. King first gave his I Have a precursor to his I Have a Dream speech. In 1963 as well, Malcolm X gives his famous Message to the Grassroots speech at King Solomon Baptist Church in Detroit. And it's in that speech outlined his basic black nationalist philosophy and really established him as a major critic to the nonviolent approach of the existing civil rights movement. Malcolm X continued to have a major presence in Detroit, hosting meetings in various locations as a part of being a member of the Nation of Islam. The UAW has a major presence in Detroit and in Detroit politics. The Vietnam War is going on. And then, of course, we have the 1967 Detroit uprising that takes place. And Detroiters are embracing the national Black Power movement, and the Black Arts movement starts to take shape. So before I ask Allie and Shirley to respond to impressions of those happenings, I'm going to give a couple of quick visuals of the 60s in Detroit. I'm just going to rest on this image. This photo is a photo of Harold Neal, the artist whom the exhibition is organized around, and just happened to have been photographed by Alli Mcgee. So, yeah, I'm just going to let this, just going to rest here for a while as we just talk about the 60s and the onset of the Black Arts movement. But in the 60s in general, so there's a lot of electricity in the air. You know, talk about how that felt, what that energy was like. Are there any events that stand out for you?
Yeah. there were overwhelming incidents and activity taking place at that time, and a lot of speeches and a lot of protesting, and powerful artwork done by many artists at that time, and particularly you will see that in the book about Harold Neal and other artists as well that were very active in that time. And we thought that that was the way that we could work on our behalf, was visually. Powerful images that people could see, recall, and take to heart what was really going on in the city at that time. And it was difficult for the artists to get venues to show their work. In fact, sometimes local churches would take part and have summer art exhibits in their parking lot, and they would string up wires and clothesline where we could display our work for the lack of having a better venue to show the work. And we had the support of the community and the churches, which we were always an active part in the turbulent times of the 60s. And so it was probably the first real push for realization about the so-called black art, a word coined during that period where everybody was wondering, what is black art? What does that entail? What's the limitations? And I think that we were all looking for answers as well, but we already knew that the approach was to do your work and express the emotions of the community as well as our own personal emotions.
Well, the Black Arts Movement began with, for most people, for me, I could say looking back, was the 1954, I can't remember, the atrocity with Emmett Till. And of course, he was the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. And it was a national movement. And so it was very, I'm not going to say easy, but I mean, it was understandable. It was, it made sense. You could certainly rationalize, the country at that time, as you said, with the early stages of the war, all of these things that were going on. And of course, those other movements came about. The war movement came about as a result of the civil rights movement. All of the writing and the coverage, and I'm reminded too of the work that Dudley Randall did, one of his poems. That I met Dudley later. He was definitely a part of the Black Arts Movement. He had a small press, broadside press that he began in the early 60s. And one of his poems was about the watching the daily goings on in Vietnam, the number of killed that day. That was sort of the news, the way Ukraine is now. They're counting, all of those who are perishing under this, in this situation. And so everything was coming at everyone at one time. And so, but you were highly motivated, and as Allie said, people wanted to express this, artists wanted to express, writers, all of these things that had sort of come to a head, so to speak. And of course, in Detroit, there were so many things, the police, the inner workings of the city, the stress, the movement of the officers, or the whole unit.
The Big Four.
With, the Big Four. I remember this was another memory that just came back. We were walking home from school, and a police car would go down the street, and we'd all stop and look at it and say, "Ooh," you know. My girlfriends and I, okay? But, you know, we were being treated as though we were not, quote unquote, welcome in our own space, and they certainly weren't welcome in this space either. So, I mean, there became a real willingness to be very open about this, you know, what was happening. So, I mean, and I know many of us weren't here in the 60s, but many of us were, so everybody could relate in their own way to that time. But for artists, as Allie pointed out again, there were very few galleries, existing galleries, that would show our work. And so we simply had to open our own spaces. That's what happened with Arts Extended. That's what happened with Contemporary Studios. That's what happened with, earlier on with Pen and Palette, what it came to be. So there were organizations out there, or groups of artists, and then of course there was all the discourse on is talking about what is Black art, and identifying what that was, and still is something people talk about. So I mean, it's an ongoing concept here, reality. And so, and of course, Harold Neal, Allie was young. Allie and I, we were just getting out of school, so.
Right. You guys were, what, in your 20s?
We were right there, right there in it, so. But it's like, I mean, but we found a way. I mean, a way was arrived at through Broadside Press. I met all these fantastic poets, Nikki Giovanni, Etheridge Knight, Gwendolyn Brooks, and then of course Chicago. You know, I mean, there was all this relationship that it was a national. You know, we were certain. And then of course 7 Black artists was a major force that began early in the time of in the late 60s.
That was an exhibit that Charles McGhee was asked to, are you talking about the exhibit or the subsequent gallery?
I'm talking about, no, I'm not talking about the gallery yet.
Okay.
I'm just saying 7 Black artists, of course, which Allie was one, and that's when, of course, when I met Allie. And so it was many things. There were many things going on. There was coming together of artists openly, everyone working in their own way, and so everyone was beginning to see, you know, this culmination. I'm just speaking of art now, and writing, and music changed. The FBI took home all these Coltrane records and was trying to find out the coding. Or something, what is he doing? What is he doing? And another, one of the other musicians, whom I cannot remember, my husband told me, but I can't remember, said, "What is Coltrane doing? You know, what is this?" And another musician asked, in other words, a fellow artisan in that area, he just said, "Train ain't gonna wait." So that was the concept that everybody was moving ahead, connecting. Theater was very different. New York, and we had excellent theater in Detroit. So many playhouses were open, plays were given, and all of these things were supported by those who supported the arts in Detroit. That was one thing that I think has not necessarily been thought of a lot.
Right.
But if it wasn't for those art lovers, those who were very mature in their knowledge of culture and what this meant to our culture, were right there. Dr. Perkins, Robert Perkins being one of them, and who covered everyone on all fronts, on every area, music, theater, was really big on theater and all of that. So there were many things, and then in early '72, we elected our first black mayor, Coleman Young, and that opened up everything in terms of just the freedom to breathe, to be acknowledged, that we acknowledged ourselves in another kind of way.
I want to get to, have you guys talk a little bit about how you were working stylistically during this period, and I'm going to jump over Allie's real quickly, since Shirley has the mic in her hand, and I'll go back to that early work of Allie's afterward. Shirley, do you remember the time?
Yes, well, this work was called Biafra Cries. The Thrill Is Gone, and part was what was going on on the continent, and the other part, The Thrill Is Gone, that's B.B. King. And so as I was painting this, I'm listening to B.B. King and painting this work of the two groups that were, a war was being waged in Nigeria?
Yeah, in Nigeria.
Nigeria, and it was a European-backed war, and I think the French, whomever, was behind this,
Yeah.
Both communities were at odds. And so there they are, three warriors who are in masks, and they've got missiles on their head, tied and wrapped. And those images I got in New York Times reporting. And so to indicate that it was a European-backed war, or adding to the conflict, there was this ad that I saw for Brooks Brothers shirts. And so I put them in Brooks Brothers shirts. So that's why they have that on. And it's a diptych, and so it's a double painting. And but at any rate, that's what I was thinking in 1970.
Yeah. Fabulous. Allie, I'm gonna just go one back and bring up a work that, I think this is in the exhibit, and something that you were working on in, what was the date on that? I think it's late 60s, maybe?
Yeah, it was not too long after the '67 protests, and later destruction of a lot of property owned in Detroit, and the National Guard was called in. And they were in your neighborhood with tanks and rifles, and it was both frightening and disgusting to have people just It's sort of like what's going on in Russia. It has come into your neighborhood and dominate. And this was a collage that I did that related to many things that led to that particular time and things that took place during that time. And it covered the Ku Klux Klan and Malcolm X and Miles Davis and like Shirley was saying, you know, the music for me, because a failed saxophonist, that the freedom of creativity was sort of like the key thing that I noticed about jazz during that time, that we were hearing improvisation on music that you never heard before. People like Thelonious Monk, you know, he was a crazy man, you know, because he's playing all of these notes that don't make sense. But this crazy man was a genius because he was taking it upon himself to change the way we listen to music and chords. And
The timing, all of it.
it was just unbelievable. And for me, it was like I was given permission now to step over the line, outside the line, because it was something that we all recognize as artists, whether you were a writer or a filmmaker or a painter, that you could take that risk to lead instead of follow.
Yeah. If each of you could speak to, just briefly, to how you get from your ideas, from these impressions and your reactions to what's going on, to what we see on the canvas or whatever media that you're working in. A little bit of process. Your
Ladies first.
How valiant of you.
All right, I will ask you again. Would you repeat that, please?
So, yeah, I'm curious about how do you get from the ideas that come about from your reactions to what you're seeing in the news, what's being uncovered all around you, what's taking place all around you. How do you get from your feelings about those things and concerns to how does that manifest in your artwork? How does you get from idea to actual art execution?
Well, you know you have the means to visualize it, whatever it may be, because you're an artist. I mean, you've been trained, so you have that. You know, and you have the ability to associate. Allie, I'm gonna look at that work again in the show when we finish. Saying that it was a collage, you try to approximate what that is, but you want to show as many levels as you can. So as Allie did with the collage of a variety of images that he had from, you know, his resources were broad, and he made those selections. Well, I went back to my study of art, and so I would go back to my traditions, the deeper traditions, the authentic traditions from the continent of Africa, specifically. And so I began to, as with the masks, and with my references to Egyptian art, one of which is in one of the pieces are in the show here. And so those are the references that I use, and they don't seem to...
That's early.
Yeah, that's early. It's called a family.
But I'm going to take you through a few images that,
Okay.
this is, I think, late 60s.
Yeah, that's the self-portrait. Okay, this is one. Right.
This is Flight
Flight into Egypt. number one. I've done several, maybe up to 10 of these. Some are, but they're relating to the tombs, the markings on the tombs. And the figure is reaching back into that era. And Flight into Egypt also, for me, had the reference of Henry O. Tanner when he painted in the 20s of what was a very unusual application that really belonged to some of the early Impressionists, or it was started then, sort of a loose kind of application with the paint. And so those were the things I was going back in my own mind to try to, I wanted it to be something that I had felt. I mean, although I lived during those particular days when the tanks were there, but where I was living, they weren't there, and I never went that way. So I didn't really have that experience, but I knew the terror, and I knew the rage, and the questioning, what's happening here as a citizen, what's going on with these people. And so, but I found so much beauty in those drawings and paintings, the cave paintings, the tomb paintings, and so that's what that's what I'm saying, that's how I would go back into my own experiences, whatever they may be, that would add to an artistic summary, and hope that people would be able to look into those through their own experience.
And I'm just going to continue with a couple of others. I think I just have a couple more of Shirley's work as it progresses through the decades. I think this was done maybe late 80s, 89, something like that. Mm-hmm. This is in the Mott-Warsh Collections collection. And this is a more recent, somewhat recent, 2017.
Well, this was the year that they celebrated the 1967 upsurge. And that is a picture, the rendition of me in my wedding dress that was not my wedding dress, but it was, in looking back, it was 50 years, and I was married 2 weeks before the riot. And so, in looking back, I put all of the things that are currently, this is, current reaction to those 50 years, and so many things that I listed. I had incarcerate before educate, stress, and then I have different streets that are listed here. Yeah, and
Black.
and
Black is beautiful.
And a revolution at the top, and Black is beautiful. So those were things that I put in this painting, and sort of to bring myself up to date, and and I find that so much of it is still occurring. There's some, the process has been moved from, the turmoil within that all of these things have caused because of all of everything has become so, and always it will be political, but this was my sense of expression now. Current.
Allie, I'm going to ask ask you to walk us through some of the same, answer the same question or speak to the same question about the process of going from idea and your reaction to the things happening around you, to what gets executed in your art, and how you get there.
Well, one of the things that I share with Shirley is that doing research in Egypt, it was a frustrating thing to think that everything that I knew about art was based on European experience. So I decided to do my own research and went back to cave paintings and symbolism expressed there, and the tombs of Egypt and the Meta-Netra, or image and the word became one. So I thought, this is great, because I want to use these age-old symbols that are like a part of our DNA, like everything that we do is derived from those same kinds of symbols that were used by early man, we use today in advertising and in art of all kinds. This particular piece that you have there is a good friend of mine, Ibn Pori, who was very active, in the 60s, and published a book every quarter called Black Graphics International, and he would travel to Africa and back to the States, and he tried to speak in an international way about the plight of racism, and published poems, artwork, essays done by artists from all over the world. And this was the illustration that I did for a cover of one of those Black Graphics International magazines. We both attended CAS in the 50s, when people were more likely to tell you, why are you in the art curriculum? And you could be getting a job at Ford Motor Company. And Ibn and I took offense to that. And during that period, we sort of had a bond about who we were and what we were up against.
I'm going to move you to the other works. This is another work in the exhibit. I believe this was called The Last Oil.
Yes, this is was in Dr. Perkins' collection, that you mentioned, who was a staunch supporter of the arts, and he was going to, like you, piano. And he was going to be a classical pianist. He was really good, but he had an injury that made him no longer have full capacity to play the piano the way he had earlier. And this particular piece is like a cleansing of fire of the problems that we were all sort of labored by. And the piece has a figurative image, something I started to move away from the more graphic rendition of the figure to one that was more symbolic, and the use of color, shape, and form started to gravitate to what some people call abstract expressionists. Yeah, now this piece here is old as dirt. And,
1974.
yes, and here you could can see more clearly the use of symbols in the work. Something that I thought is a very powerful way of giving the viewer a place to start, because some of these are recognizable from your education. And you see the Dogon figure and some symbols of water, and so it's part of the storytelling process to give known factors in our world with the fantasies that I could add to impress the imagery that is flexible and timeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one's in the Mott-Warsh Collection as well, and got a couple of others from there.
You know, this one is called Running Wild, and you can see what looks like a head with dreadlocks, and this is probably one of the earlier uses of the banana moon horn, which became a symbol that I use repeatedly and even today. So the idea that you could have this imaginary figure that was a powerful element in our resolve. Like, you know, we had all of these heroes when we were young, like Superman and Batman and so forth and so on. But I wanted to have imagery of superheroes that were from our background. Why don't we have any superheroes? You know? So you could create those because we had the opportunity to paint our own images and create storylines that were real and storylines that were powerful, educational experience for the viewers of all ages.
Yeah, no boundaries. Yeah. And again, and these last two and the one or two that follow exemplify Allie's transition from that of a figurative artist to his interest in abstraction. Reviews.
Yeah, that's another. And the other thing that when I said I had desire to link my artwork to eternity was that my palette, which was usually earthen, and because this planet, as they call the blue planet, is sky, the water, and the earth. So I spent a lot of time what you might call abstract landscapes, which depict us in that environment of the blue marble, as we're called here on this planet.
Mm-hmm. I think this is the last one.
To quote Charlie Chan, I say more of same.
Right. Well, and I think we're going to stop here because I think we're just about out of time. And although I would love to keep going, I have all kinds of questions about the role of symbolism in each of your work and so many other things. But I think we should probably open up the conversation to the audience now, if there are any questions.
I have one. I just want to ask, you mentioned about the Pen and Palette Club. How much did that pivot or cause things to come into being the Pen and Palette Club? Because I tried to do some research on it from Grand Rapids, Michigan, but been able to retrieve and get to some Michigan Chronicle or something, what significant was the Pen and Palette Club?
And if I can ask if you can briefly summarize the question before you answer, because they don't
Yes.
have microphones. Thank you so
Right,
much.
yes. The Pen and Palette Club, according to my research, began began we'll say in the early 40s. I believe that was the time period. And those were, they began as classes at the Urban League, became the Urban League, and it was right there. Are you from Detroit?
No.
No, okay, I'm just gonna give the streets. It's still there, but the offices are no longer there. But it really began with sort of like painting classes, and where artists could come and work together in the evenings. And then later, as more artists attended, or, as time was, it would be post-war, Second World War. I'm thinking, or remembering, I wasn't there at that time, but artists like Huey Lee Smith, you can look him up too, to see that he began, his early activity was through an Palette Club. He was an artist from Cleveland who worked his way to Detroit and was a definite force here. And there were probably some others, I'm not really familiar with those names, but, then moving into, and I believe came into the 50s. So that would be sort of the earliest group of artists that were working. And what I realized, and when I was a student at Wayne, I remember this drawing class, drawing painting, and this one artist, his name was Robert Taylor. And, sort of my own understanding of things. I mean, this gentleman could draw, as they say, if you know what I mean. I mean, he was not a student. He was in painting 101 or whatever, but he was spectacular. And it let me know that there were so many other artists out there who were, I'm sure he had lessons, and all of that, but for him to be in the college working like this, he was really working at a post-degree level, but there he was, in oil painting and could just draw forever. And so these were like realizations that you come to know that whatever we're doing, there's just so much more that is there, that's sort of a traditions that we didn't even know that were there. And so those working in a group and realizing that people come from all over to be a part of a group is, you understand how important the groups are and how important that interchange is. I hope I answered your question.
Well, the reason why I was commenting, I just discovered an artist I've never heard before, Booker Helms. He's a woodcarver.
Oh.
Vice president of the Palette Club, and I was fortunate enough to have a piece by him through the suite.
Oh.
And that's why I came here, just to get more information about him.
Okay. Tell me his name again.
Booker Helms.
Booker
Helms.
Helms.
Yes.
Booker Helms. I'll look that up as well. We'll see where. Okay. Well, that's what I'm saying. That there were all these artists, and prior to that, and a lot of those artists were working right in what we call now the cultural center. This was before the medical center took all that over. But that was an artist area early in the teens. There were African-American artists who worked for print companies. Now you'll say, you have a card with you? Well, then the whole card thing started with people who would prepare their cards, but they weren't printed, they were hand done. And so a lot of African-American artists worked for these firms and did cards, the calligraphy and all of that wonderful design worked on at that time. Another artist, Rose Poole, there's another person out there that's famous that has her name, but she was a watercolorist. She was listed in one of the early directories. She lived on Woodson in Detroit, right in the heart of the cultural center. And she was a watercolorist, enough to be noted, and so you find out so many things. And you're very fortunate to have the work as well.
Any other questions?
I hope.
No more questions. Well,
I have another one too.
Yes.
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 I picked up a painting, I believe by the great Dr. Cleveland Taylor.
Yes, Lady Taylor, yes.
She brought it over here to confirm it. But actually, it's right here.
Oh, we'll look at that.
Actually, I brought both of the pieces. This piece is by, this is, we have one. This is a painting, I believe, is by Dr. Cleveland Taylor. I talked to him before. That's why I brought it over here to see your opinion on this. 1969. I just bring it over here because I'm from the western side of the state. I have no clue as concerning extended resources, so that's why I'm here, ma'am, just to hear all of your perspective on this, because I think it's very significant historical-wise.
All right. I'll take a picture of it and I'll check with, I'll send it to, Dr. Taylor. So she can,
yeah.
okay. Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
If there are other questions, you also have the opportunity to meet the artists over when they're signing books. Although, keep in mind, we've got lots of people here, and so we'll try to keep the line flowing, and we've got mix and mingle. Yes?
Mr. McGhee, you mentioned when you were younger, you drew on walls and things like that.
Yes.
I'm a grandmother, and I have a 5-year-old that we allow to do that too. What would you suggest as enrichment when she's at her grandmother's house for me to do to encourage her to continue her gift?
I think one of the things that you provide, of course, is encouragement and then materials, because when you have the excess of these materials, you just pick them up and you start. And along with that encouragement, you're on the way, you're headed in the right direction. Like I said, my mom had to unfold a 10-foot long piece of paper for which we would get down and draw and practice, because I came from Charleston, West Virginia, and for a while we lived in Institute, West Virginia, which is a name because the college was there, and so came Institute. But there was a class then that I had that I'll never forget. It's like when you were speaking of those large records, or when I was in grade school, I'd never seen a record that big before in my life, And in the evening, on one day a week, the teacher would have you close your eyes, fold your arms, and she would put on these giant 33 1/3 records, and we were required to listen to it. And then, when the record was over, she would pass out these wonderful crayons and manila paper and ask us to draw what image came to mind when we had that musical experience. That was the best time of my life because, you know, all the children were expressing how they felt and they were drawing from their imagination. And I think, you know, once you provide the environment, maybe music would be added as well, and the supplies, and you just cut them loose. Because we used to joke about when you're born, children come here as geniuses. But once they get here, we start telling them all the things they cannot do. Hey, you might as well give it up, you know, because you want them to know all the things that they can do. And I use that formula, I think you'll have an artist on your hands.
I'd just like to add that when you get the materials, get an 18 by 24 pad. And when she finishes that, just flip it over, ask her not to tear it out right away. And then, because you can use the back as well, but as you noticed, Allie was doing this, right? So that's the motion you're gonna need, because that's what she's gonna do. If you go into these little, I call them knuckle drawings, where you only move your, you know, these little teeny things, so you've gotta give them room to spread out. And a nice box of, you know, 36, 42, 72 crayons, because you cannot blend very well markers. Markers are lovely. That's, as my artist son says, that's the special effects. So you add that will be later, but she needs to be able to spread that out, let that color go all the way, and you know, just, and she will love you more.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. Great advice, great question. Thank you all for joining us again. Please stay. We have refreshments back there. We have, again, the book signing. And then I please ask also on your way out, either exit, if you could just take 1-2 minutes and fill out our very brief one-sided survey. We'd love to get feedback. So if you say, oh my gosh, we want more programs like this, let us know. And thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right.